Hello, everybody. Bonjour, salve, sziasztok. Does anybody want to know my pronoun before I begin? Or not an issue? Look, I'm going to bring you some bad news. And the bad news is that people like you and the traditions that you come from do not understand the problem that we are confronted with. The historical problem of conservatives of the right, when they deal with the cultural revolution that's sweeping the Western world, is that they've never addressed the question, why is it getting stronger and stronger all the time? I mean, why are ideas that you and I are fairly clear or fairly stupid, don't make very much sense, gaining so much traction, gaining so much momentum? Why is it that you have a situation where some of the leading cultural figures of our times, leading politicians of our times, leading intellectuals are essentially saying and talking about ideals that are the very antithesis of Western civilization or Western culture was all about? And I think the reason for that is because we're always blaming somebody else. Right? We always think that the problem is that these people are somehow working behind our back and are tricking us to do something. We never actually think about our own responsibility for the spread of what is called woke. We don't think of the fact that perhaps people like ourselves in the past or previous generations might have been too cowardly or lacked the intellectual resources to fight back. There's always been a lot of complacency. And I always remember very, very clearly before COVID, going to the United States and arguing with Americans about this issue. And I was trying to explain to them that this whole phenomenon that we're talking about comes from above, right? The ideals that we are discussing with don't come from below. It's not ordinary people that have come up with these ideas. They come from above. Right? And I remember debating and telling them, well, look, you Americans in particular will find that every single one of your institutions, without exception, will follow what the universities have done. You too will adopt the same cultural practices. And I remember this one guy, I always get into arguments with Americans. This one guy gets up and says, Frank, you're so wrong. You're such an idiot. How could you say that every institution will become woke? Our corporations, are all interested in making profit. They're going to stand up against this. There's no way that big businessmen are going to follow the path of university professors. And then another person puts up his hand and says, Frank, you don't realize we have stirred the American institutions that are going to resist woke. I said, which one is that? This is sports. Sports, American sport, is so robust, is so athletic, is so masculine, it will never become invested in this. And just look what happens. Big business in the United States is gone LGBTQ++++, to the point at which there aren't enough letters in the alphabet anymore. They're trying to reinvent the English language and the English alphabet to add a few more letters to it, just for the future. It's a big business. Look at sport. Every American sport, from NASCAR, which used to be a sport that Southern conservatives used to love, all the way to basketball, all the way to football, has become committed to taking the knee. I mean, there's nothing more nauseating for me than when you see athletes taking the knee and in a kind of subservient way, acting slavishly. So what I'm arguing is that the phenomenon we're talking about, I don't think it is Marxism, we can have a debate about that, or has anything to do with Marxism, is very much a top-down sort of development. And the origins of this was already recognized by many thinkers. The problem was already recognized by people who had perspicacity in the 1970s. In 1972, one of the advisors to President Nixon basically said, Richard, we've lost the culture war. Almost every single opinion-making institution has gone over the other side. We may run the White House, but we don't anymore have the intellectual, moral, or cultural support to carry on with this. And the problem that he'd identified, but didn't understand, was this. I remember this because I'm probably the oldest person in this room. And I remember being a student radical in the 1960s. And in the 1960s, when we were student radicals, we used to have blowback. People would kind of fight back against us. We had big debates. People would stand up against us. By the time I became a university professor in 1972, when I got my first job, there was literally a handful of us who were professors in the university who was prepared to fight back against the Cultural Revolution. And what you saw in the university was essentially a process whereby these so-called radicals who promoting woke ideals were kicking up against an open door. So the point I want to make, first of all, is that the main responsibility for the rise of woke is the bourgeoisie of Europe. It is the capitalist class in Europe who basically gave way at every single instance. In Holland, for example, they basically said, oh, these guys are woke, they are already radical, we'll make them like us. When they grow up, when they become 30, 35, they will become good Dutch entrepreneurs. They said the same thing in Belgium. Oh yeah, when these guys become 25, 26, 27, they'll forget about their youthful radicalism. But what they didn't understand, and something that sociological theory teaches us, is that every generation influences the next. And it usually takes about 5 generations before new ideals become institutionalized. And I think what happened is that people just don't understand this, that they basically are saying, oh, it's not a big problem, it's just a bunch of student radicals. It will stop at the universities. Now, today, they don't say that because obviously it hasn't stopped at the universities in Europe. But I know that when I travel and I talk to people, for example, when I went to France recently, I talked to people in Paris about the problem of woke. They say, oh, that's an American phenomenon. We French are very lucky. Apparently there's a cordon sanitaire in France against wokish kind of ideas. They don't realize that France has already become influenced by those kinds of sentiments. You go to Italy. I go to Lombardy, I go to Milan quite often, and I talk to people there. And they, oh, no, Italy's all right. Italy is not like America or England. We don't have woke. And I tell them, why don't you watch Ellie Schlein and her party and see what they really are about. And you realize that unless you do something very, very significant, Ellie Schlein will be the future of Italy. When you open your eyes and you basically begin to wake up, there's no sense in which people really understand that wokishness has already acquired a really important foothold in many, many institutions. And there are good reasons for that. My job today is to tell you why woke is spreading in the European context. And I think there are 2 forces that are driving the spread of woke in our continent. The first one is American soft power. I mean, American soft power is really important, even in Hungary, which is one of the most anti-woke country is the most, I think, anti-woke country in the world. Even in Hungary, you can see that woke soft power, American soft power, does have an incredible influence. When you watch something like Netflix, have you guys ever heard of Netflix? I mean, watch every TV program on Netflix, and every TV program is the same. The white heterosexual guy is an idiot, right? I mean, he can barely tie his shoelaces. He's so stupid, right? Very insensitive. The homosexual interior decorator, it's always an interior decorator, knows all about food, he's a real foodie, tells you how to live a healthy life. He's got an incredibly good body, right? He's emotionally very, very literate, and he's very good at, in a sense, apologizing for the behavior of his heterosexual friend. But that was This is the program of 15 years ago. The new Netflix program has made a modification. So if any of you watched Sex Education, I think you should, as politicians or would-be politicians, you should watch it. Because sex education is so interesting. In sex education, which is really about promoting transgender ideology, you have a situation where the only sensitive people in the program are trans kids. I mean, the two trans main characters are the only ones. They're the ones that are fighting against what's called heteronormativity. I signed up to that, heteronormativity. It's who I am. It's part of my identity. But in these TV programs, everybody other than the trans kids have got a major kind of problem. Now just imagine if you're a 15-year-old kid in Milan or in Paris or Budapest or Warsaw watching Sex Education and all these programs, you will begin to draw the conclusion that what's really, really cool is to basically go out and give yourself a pronoun. That it is really, really cool to be transgender. And when you look at youth culture, the way it's began to kick in, you'll find that, especially in the urban centers, it's become extremely powerful. And even more, because in addition to Netflix and other forms of soft power, you have music, American music. I mean, kids in Central Europe don't listen to, Polish or Czech or Hungarian folk music, right? They don't listen to the music of their parents or their ancestors. They listen to American music, rap music, and other kind of stuff. And the message that comes through all the time is that it's really, really cool to be woke. And it's really, really uncool to be like us. I mean, people like us have lost it. We're on the wrong side of history. Or to use their American expression, we don't get it. So that's the first driver, American soft power. And American soft power is a huge enemy that we face because it insidiously sort of manages to manipulate particularly young people. The second one, the second major transmitter of wokeness in Europe is the European Union. I mean, is anybody surprised by the institutions of the European Union? I mean, I didn't realize until I came to Brussels and I had to begin to read the different documents. I really didn't, I must have been very, very naive, just how much these ideals have become integral to the outlook of the European Union bureaucrats, the Eurocrats, basically. It's almost as if you can imagine these Eurocrats get up in the morning and they brush their teeth and they basically say, this is going to be an inclusion morning for me, right? It's going to be an inclusion morning for me because, I believe in diversity. Yeah. When you ask them what they mean by inclusion or diversity, and you should ask them sometimes what they really mean by it, they struggle. They got all these Ehrschatz values, what in Old English we call bullshit values, which they casually, sort of draft in their documents. And when they draft them in their documents, I don't know if you noticed this, I'm sure there are MEPs here or legal scholars here. When they draft their documents and internalize all these new concepts, they always say that this is something that's been advised to them by the experts, by the stakeholders. That apparently there are all these people around who are giving them expert advice about the importance of this. But the most important thing that I've noticed the European Union is doing and is leading is mainstreaming gender. Mainstreaming gender, not only mainstreaming gender, but introducing the concept of gender conditionality, which basically means that in the Czech Republic or in Romania, you want to get some money from the European Union, you got to basically mainstream gender. You got to demonstrate that you're extremely sensitive to this issue, that you're aware, is a word they kind of use, and very much indicate to them that you're prepared to play the game. Now, the problem is that you probably think that this is a joke. You probably think that this is something you have to do. You kind of pretend to accept it. But the minute you begin to sign up to this, what gender mainstreaming becomes very, very real. And it becomes extremely potent and very, very powerful. So how does this work? So yesterday, one of my friends sent me the document. I don't like reading things out. A document from the Parliamentary Legislative Resolution on equal pay. And the draft terminology used says that when we talked about these kinds of issues in 1957, medical and biological fields did not really understand that the definition of sex is more diverse than simply man and woman. In other words, what they're saying is that in 1957, we had this very primitive idea, this very outdated idea, that recognized that sex was really, biological sex was really about a man and a woman. And isn't that funny that in 1957 we were so stupid to believe this? Because now, in 2023, we can leave those old, outdated ideas behind. The European Union is committed to leaving those old ideas behind, and we're now going to introduce a kind of commitment to discussing sexual distinctions, not just as between men and women, but about as dozens of other kind of genders. And not only that, what they're saying is that if you don't recognize this, if you don't recognize the new definition of biological sex, you're going to pay a price, you're going to pay a penalty for this. So this is something that is imposed through the European Union, not just on you, but all European citizens. Now here we come to what I think is the central battlefield in Europe. And the central battlefield is demonstrated by the fact that what they are saying is that anything that was good or seen as being positive in 1957 is by definition bad in 2023. They call it outdated ideas. They basically say that these are outdated ideas and we have to come up with a new language, a totally new language that we take forward in our world. I think that this is a very big problem because what you're really saying is that we need to detach Europe and European cultures from their historical origins. What they are really saying is that the legacy of the past, the cultural legacy of the past, which organically links us to our ancestors, to what has gone on before, needs to be ruptured. That what we need is both a language and an attitude that's got nothing to do. It's what in Chinese politics they used to call year zero. You know, we're living in a year zero and we're following year zero politics. I just want to basically end by saying that as the language changes, we become different people if we accept it. Let me give you one example that shocked me. I've done a lot of work on education in my time, but I was surprised to discover that the European Union, thanks to the advice of the United Nations and UNESCO, now argues that we should no longer use the term sex education. Now, sex education, when I was young, basically meant learning about the birds and the bees, learning about how humans reproduce themselves, learning about biology. That's what sex education was. It's an okay subject, you know, not the most important subject, not as important as literature or philosophy or theology, but okay, you have to learn that. Now, they tell us that sex education should no longer be used because it's outdated, everything is outdated, and instead of sex education, we should have sexuality education. Now, you might think, well, so what? Sex education, sexuality, so what? But actually, what does sexuality education mean? It no longer means anything to do with biological men and women. It no longer has got anything to do with sexual reproduction. Sexuality education is about gender and gender identity. It's your sexuality, how you define your sexuality. And in every school in the European Union, there is now an attempt being made to bring in sexuality education and essentially teach 4-, 5-, 6-year-old children about their gender. And in particular, not just tell them who they are about their gender, but just to tell them, hey, Mary, hey, Johnny, you think that you're a boy, you think you're a girl, but if you discover when you're 10 years old or 14 years old that you're actually maybe somebody different, that's cool. That's okay. We'll help you out with that, because sexuality education teaches you that you are fluid as an individual, as a non-binary individual. You might think this is so what? It's a small matter. But what it does is that it enslaves our children. European children who become subjected to this educational process basically have their identities as boys and girls sabotaged, disrupted. When you're 6 and 7, you actually, being a boy or a girl is really crucially important about who you are. That's me as a boy. If you begin to have doubts, because this is what you learn in sexuality education, if you're putting a question mark about your sex, then your very identity, the most foundational dimension of your identity, begins to be called into question. And we're now seeing in Europe the beginnings of an American-type identity crisis sweeping young people to the point at which their identity is being disrupted with very important mental health consequences. The most important target of the war against the past, of all data language, is children. And the second important target of this war against the past is the family. One of my colleagues in MCC Brussels is working on a document called The European Union and the Disappearing Family. And what she means by disappearing family, how the family disappears, is by the fact that if you look at EU documents on the family, they talk a lot about children, they talk a lot about women, they talk a lot about LGBTQ families, but what they never talk about is a family. The family has disappeared in these documents. And not only that, but when the family is mentioned, and a few places where the family is mentioned, the family is mentioned as an impediment to the well-being of women and children. Somehow the family becomes responsible for horrible things that happen to women and for very bad things that happen to children. So basically, if you follow the logic of those documents, you would never want to be in a family. I mean, who wants to live in this horrible institution which basically flourishes by doing terrible things to people? So this seems to me to be really quite important for us to understand that the whole tendency towards the spread of woke within the European continent, which is ultimately the responsibility of the people that run our society, is actually targeting our children, targeting our families, but most important of all, most important than anything else, is targeting our past. It is a war against the past. They want us to forget where we come from. They want us to forget who we are. They want us to forget about the legacy of Greece, the legacy of Rome, the legacy of the Judeo-Christian culture. They want to forget us about the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And basically, they want to free us of all these horrible things that have happened. And if they do manage to free us and liberate us from our culture, then basically we lose the capacity of knowing where our future lies. And we lose the capacity of finding our way within the future. So there's a lot to struggle about. And my only advice to everybody is don't point the finger at the woke. Point the finger at yourself and ask the question, what are we doing to fight it? I ask that for conservatives because one of the most irritating things about conservatives is they always tell you, oh, the teachers are messing up our children. I say, well, how many conservatives do you know who have encouraged their children to be teachers? Right? How many conservatives do you know that try to become university professors? In America especially, I know of American professors who said it's much more comfortable working in a think tank than struggling in a university. They basically given up the university. And I know loads and loads of conservative people who talk about education all the time, but they would be very unhappy if their son or daughter became a teacher. You know, they should become business ladies or businessmen. That's, bankers or doctors or dentists. But teacher, well, if that's your attitude and you leave your children to be taught by the other side, what's going to happen? Why complain that they're messing around with your kids' heads when you haven't made that kind of contribution. So really, we got to look to ourselves, because we are both the problem, but we're also the solution. If we take this phenomenon seriously and actually call the culture war by its right name and not shy away from that, not say that the culture war is a secondary phenomenon, if we can adopt a more robust fighting attitude, then we will get the ordinary people on our side. Ordinary people all over Europe will support us against the elites, against the corporations, against the people on top who are promoting this ideology. And we will win. And we will win, I'm sure, but I would rather it was sooner rather than later. Thank you.